Hey, and welcome back to another day of photography learning with Leroy Tademy from Tademy Photography. And today we're going to be going over the exposure triangle. I do want to preface, there might be some background noise in here today. It is really hot outside. It's Labor Day and I just can't go without the air conditioner today. So you might hear a little bit of air conditioner blowing in the back. It might kick on, it might kick off. But for the sake of me not sweating profusively, I'm going to go ahead and run the course with the AC on. In future videos, if you guys think the AC is too much of a distraction, just let me know and I'll come at night and film or something like that. But for today, we're gonna have the AC rolling. It'll probably kick on and off during the course, but in the sake of safety and not sweating profusively, I'm going to go ahead and teach with the AC on. So let's start a little brief, like high-level view of what the exposure triangle is. The exposure triangle consists of three different aspects, right? This is a triangle, three different things. You got aperture, you got ISO, and you got shutter speed. Now two of these sound real familiar to you guys because in the previous course, we talked about aperture priority mode, and we also talked about shutter priority mode. We talked briefly about ISO and how it was part of each of those modes, but we never really talked about dialing it in or dialing it out. So today we're going to go a little bit more in depth on ISO as well. So for the first section, let's start with aperture, because aperture is the one that most people like to work with because it gives you a little bit more noticeable creativity, so to speak. I don't know if you guys noticed, like probably a few years back, or not a few years back, years ago, Apple came out with portrait mode where they could take photos and make the background look like blurry and stuff like that. So that was a play on aperture when they did that. So let's start talking about aperture, which most people realize, or most people use aperture every day when they shoot portrait mode on their iPhone. So aperture is pretty simple. It's the amount of light that you let into the camera sensor. So all your cameras have inside, and you can't see it on this camera because it's closed, but they all have behind this little curtain that you see, there is a sensor back there. And in that sensor, that's what receives the light. And then when it shows the sensor, that's how much light hits on it. But it works multiple ways. So right now we're just talking about the aperture wise. Aperture is the amount, so there's a hole in the camera, right? As you can see, this is the camera, right? There's a hole inside of it. There's a light that shines in there. If your camera's, I don't know if you can see this in there. Oh, I don't have a card in. But inside of there, you can see there's like some blades. And I'll put some images up in the course so you guys can see. But there's like these blades. And when the blades, when the camera focuses, the aperture can be like this, which would be like a wide open aperture, probably somewhere around like 1.2 or something like that. Like this lens is a 1.2 lens. It's a Canon 50mm L lens, and it goes to 1.2 aperture. So its aperture can get super wide, and the wide aperture lets in more light. So imagine if you had a hole and you had a flashlight, and you sent the flashlight through the hole, and everything else was dark. You'd get like just light through the hole, right? So if you close the hole, as you can see, the hole is now smaller. I'll do it this way just so this is the original hole, right? So if we close the hole, less light can get through the flashlight. See how tiny the hole is? Right there, okay? So big aperture or smaller aperture number, bigger hole, letting in more light. Smaller hole, larger aperture. So think about golf in this instance. So in golf, best score is low score, right? So best score is low score. So the smaller the number, the better the score, right? So if you shoot par 4, you hit it in 2, that's an equal 2. I don't know if I'm getting too nerdy with this, but in golf, the least amount of strokes you hit, the better you're doing. If you hit more strokes, you get a bigger number, which is not as good for golf. So I like to think of my apertures like that. The smaller the number, the bigger the hole, the more light you're letting in, the more you're getting in your camera, the more illumination to your image. The bigger the number, the smaller the hole, the lower the score in golf, if that makes sense. So this would be like an F22 or F18. But then as you go this way, you get more like F12. I hope that makes sense. If not, leave me something in the comments. I'll touch on it some more. Okay, so we kind of understand smaller number, bigger aperture, bigger number, smaller aperture. It's backwards, and I know, and it takes a while to understand, but the more you work with your camera, the more you play around with aperture, you'll start to understand it a little bit better. So, when you're at a wider aperture, you're letting in more light. So it's gonna make things more soft in the background, more blurry, because the light is not as focused that's coming through. So when you tighten up your aperture, you're gonna get a more of a ping, like a firelight come through your camera. So it's gonna make everything nice and sharp and crisp. So that's what you want to remember. Smaller hole, bigger aperture, more focused image. Bigger hole, more light, less control over what's in focus. F1.2 wide open aperture. So I'm saying all this and you're probably thinking, what does this have to do with photography? Well, the most important thing about it is that you want to understand is with aperture, you can decide how much you want your viewer to see. So for instance, with this camera setup that I have right now, you can see me in focus and the background is a little bit out of focus. I'm shooting at a wider aperture. I also have lights over here, here, and here, which you can't really see on screen on the camera, but these lights are all working in coordination to give you this exposure that we have. Okay, so pretty much what aperture is, it is the amount of light that's coming through the lens. It's the amount of light that's coming through the lens. That's aperture. So now, let's talk about shutter speed. So, as you saw before, in our last video, I was showing you, or in the earlier part of this video, the camera has a curtain inside, and this curtain covers the sensor. And the sensor is what records the image, right? So you have a lens on there, you decide aperture, whatever size aperture you want, and that's how much light's gonna actually come through. But the shutter decides how fast it goes up and down. So for instance, if you have a shutter speed of 1/125th of a second, or 1 second, let's go for demonstration purposes, 1 second exposure. It'll go like this. So it let in 1 second light. If I had a 2 second exposure, it would go 1, 2. It would let in 2 seconds of light. If I had a 5 second exposure, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So what happens if you have a half second exposure? Half a second. Does that make sense? These are not exact times. I'm just doing it for demonstration purposes. But the faster shutter speed will be like a half second versus a 1 second. So that's what shutter speed does. So when the light hits the sensor through the lens, the amount of time that the sensor is exposed to the light is the shutter speed. So for instance, if someone's running by the camera and you have a slow shutter speed, if it goes person running and then it closes, the person's gonna look like a ghost or like very, very blurry because they're moving the whole time the shutter's open. So what if we have like a really fast shutter, like 1,000th of a second? So it'd be like, I can't go that fast, but if somebody's moving, it's gonna freeze them. It only catches them when they're going by. So that's what we wanna realize, that the faster the shutter speed, the faster it freezes the action. So with shutter speeds, you'll typically have slower shutter speeds will add more blur. Faster shutter speeds will freeze action. That's pretty much shutter speed. We'll go over some in detail a little bit more on different types of shutter speeds that are out there. But for now, I just wanted to get you guys warmed up to the idea of what shutter speed is and how it actually works. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about ISO. ISO is your camera's sensitivity to light. So you've already heard about aperture, how wide the lens goes and how much light the lens let in. You heard about shutter, how fast it opens and closes. Now, let's talk about how sensitive your camera is to light. So back in the film days, probably before a lot of you were born, or maybe some of you remember film, it's making a comeback. It's kind of like vinyl, you know, it's coming back for a little while and then might dip out again. But a lot of creative photographers now are using film. And film comes in a lot of different film speeds. So you'd have 100 ISO film, 200 ISO film, 400 ISO film. 100 speed, 200 speed, 400 speed, 800 speed, 1600 speed, 3200 speed. So those are the different types of speeds you can get for film. So the higher the number, the darker the environment you could take photos in. So if you would have like 3200 speed film, you could take a picture in a darker scenario and still have a good exposure, because the way the chemicals worked up and whatever they did with the film, it made it more sensitive to light. So your camera has that all built in. So it has 100. Most of your basic cameras will have 100 speed, 200, 400, 800, 1600, 3200, 6400, 12,800. Those will be the stops that you'll see most of the time on cameras. More advanced camera bodies like the R5 and the 5D Mark IV and some of those higher end bodies will have what they call third stops, where you'll see 100, 125th of a second. 100, you'll see 125, you'll see 200, you'll see 320, you'll see other little increments in between the full stops. So ISO comes in a bunch of different stops, and what it does is as it goes up, it gets more sensitive to light. So imagine you're in a pitch black dark room or a really, really dark room and there's no light really coming in. What you would do is you'd set your ISO to a higher ISO setting. So if you're in a brighter room and you don't need as much light sensitivity, you would set your camera to a lower ISO. So it's maybe something around 100 or 200. I like to characterize ISO as when you go to the eye doctor and he puts the dilation in your eyes, right? So you can see so you can look at your eyes a little bit more in detail so they don't close up when he's trying to view inside. So pretty much ISO is that dilation that the eye doctor puts in your eye so your eye can let in more light so the doctor can see more inside the eye. So the more dilation you put, the higher the ISO. The less dilation you put, the lower the ISO. So that's ISO in a handbasket. It's pretty much the sensitivity of your camera to light. So sometimes when you're outside and it's super bright, you put on sunshades. Why do you put on sunshades? Because the light is hitting your eyes so hard. Your camera has the same thing. Well, it's not exactly the same thing. There's other things that we could put inside the camera like sunshades, but for this lesson, let's call the ISO your built-in sunshades for your camera when you're out on a shoot. So that is ISO in a handbasket.